I am 97 years old. I keep a letter in my kitchen drawer. It's written in German, in a careful hand, on paper so old, the creases have gone almost transparent. People see it and they assume it's something my grandfather wrote. A letter from the old country. That's what it looks like. It's not from my grandfather. It's from a German soldier, a prisoner of war. He picked potatoes and cut corn on farms near our town in the summer of 1944. And years after the war ended, he wrote this letter back to the family that fed him. I take the liberty of writing a letter to you, it says. In 1944, I worked for you at your farm as a prisoner of war. I thank you, and you treated me so well. Most people don't know this story. Almost nobody alive remembers it now. But during the Second World War, the United States brought over 380,000 German prisoners to this country, more than 50,000 Italians. They were housed in more than 500 camps in nearly every state in the Union, and dozens of those camps were right here in Minnesota, in small towns, on fairgrounds, beside state parks, on vacant farms. And the people who lived in those towns were asked to do something that sounds simple until you actually have to do it. Work alongside the enemy. Feed him. House him. Treat him like a human being, while your own sons are overseas getting killed by men who wore the same uniform. So let me tell you exactly what happened. I grew up in southern Minnesota, German stock. A lot of us were. The number one ethnic group in the state was German. Go to any small town, New Ulm, Owatonna, Princeton, Olivia, and every other family had come over between 1850 and 1910 from somewhere in Germany. People still spoke the language at kitchen tables. My parents spoke it. Their neighbors spoke it. It was just the way things were. Then the war came. The young men left. The farms and the canning factories had nobody to work them. By 1943, the University of Minnesota's agricultural extension was sounding the alarm. There weren't enough hands to bring in the harvest. Potatoes were coming in. Onions were coming in. The canning operations in Owatonna and Sleepy Eye ran on manual labor, and the men who would have done that work were in North Africa or the Pacific. Some of them were already dead. And then the prisoners started arriving. The way it worked was this. Rommel's Africa Corps surrendered to the British Eighth Army in 1943. That's 200,000 soldiers sitting in the North African desert, and the British couldn't take care of them. Mainland Europe was occupied. So the British asked America, "Can you take them?" And here was the thing. The U.S. military was already shipping war supplies to North Africa on Liberty-class cargo ships. Those ships dropped their loads and came back empty. So they started filling them with prisoners. No beds on the ships. Each man got a blanket and a life jacket. That was it. They arrived in New York by the thousands. Then they went west by rail. Some of them threw leaflets out the train windows as they crossed the country, telling American citizens they were going to lose the war. They still believed that. The Africa Corps men were proud. They'd fought under Rommel. A lot of them still thought Germany could win. Now, what most people don't understand is that the United States made a deliberate decision about how to treat these men. The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid it out. Prisoners of war had to receive food of the same quality and quantity as American military personnel, housing that matched what our own soldiers had, medical care, dental care, reading materials, religious services, recreation. The U.S. decided to follow that convention to the letter. And there was a reason. If the Germans on the front lines knew that surrendering to Americans meant decent treatment, they'd be more likely to put their hands up instead of fighting to the last man. And if we treated their prisoners well, maybe, just maybe, they'd think twice about mistreating ours. We don't know for certain how many American lives that saved, but we know it worked. Word got back to the battlefront. Germans surrendered to Americans whenever they could. The prisoners arrived in Minnesota and were put to work. Canning factories, potato farms, logging operations up north in Bena and Reamer and Deer River. They picked corn. They harvested peas. In Springfield and New Ulm, they worked the brick and tile plants in winter. At the canning operation in Owatonna, some seasons The entire operation, 100% of it, ran on prisoner labor. Without those men, the food didn't get processed. The crops didn't get in. That was the reality. But here is the part of the story that still gets me, even now. The camps sent the prisoners out to the farms with paper bags, sandwiches. That was their lunch. And the farm wives would look at those paper bags and say, "Nobody can do a day's work on that." They'd feed the sandwiches to the dogs. Then they'd bring the Germans inside, sit them down at the kitchen table, and feed them exactly the way they'd feed any threshing crew. Potatoes, meat, bread, coffee, and they'd talk to them in German, because half the people in those towns still spoke it. I want you to understand what that means. Their sons were overseas fighting the German army. Some of those sons were never coming home. And these women sat the enemy down at their family table and fed them a full meal. Not because anyone ordered them to, because that's what you do when someone's working your land, and you were raised to feed the people who help you. A professor from St. Olaf College named Howard Hong. He's heard the YMCA was working with prisoners and volunteered. He brought art supplies, woodworking tools. He set up correspondence courses through the University of Minnesota. The prisoners played chess. They had sports. They read newspapers. They actually got the New York Times. There was a version printed in German. They built chapels inside their barracks. Howard Hong understood something most people didn't. These men had known nothing but the Nazi system since the early 1930s. Some of them had been fighting since 1937 in Spain. If you gave them a taste of something different, education, choice, freedom, some of them would start to question which side of the story they wanted to be on. In Princeton, a farmer named O.J. Odegaard had Italian prisoners working his potato farm. He set up a canteen where they could buy beer and cigarettes. He paid them $3 a day, same as the local help. They worked 10 hours, same as everybody else. And those Italians, everyone in town remembered them. They sang all day long on the flatbed trucks, in the fields, walking through town. Opera, folk songs, whatever they knew. 8 weeks they were there. 80 years later, People in Princeton were still talking about the singing. Up in Moorhead, a farmer named Hank Peterson took prisoners into a downtown bar and bought them beers. That caused some trouble. 2 young nurses from St. Ansgar Hospital would go to the camp on their afternoons off and meet prisoners behind haystacks. They got caught, got arrested, got scared and released. People bent the rules because the men on the other side of the fence started to look less like the enemy and more like somebody's kid. Not everyone felt that way. Some people pushed back hard. They'd say, "These men are killing our sons. Why are we feeding them?" And that was fair. That was an honest feeling. But by and large, in town after town, the people chose the harder road. 3 prisoners escaped from the camp near Owatonna in August of 1945. They were found at the Steele County Fair, having a good time. 2 men escaped from the Bena camp and tried to take the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico in a homemade boat. They had bacon and bread. They lasted 3 days. The truth is, most of them didn't want to escape. Where would they go? There was tension inside the camps, too. The Afrika Korps men were proud, nationalistic. When newer prisoners arrived after D-Day, men who were tired of the war, who had no loyalty left to Hitler, the old guard called them traitors. In some camps across the country, prisoners were killed by other prisoners. In Minnesota, the camp commander in Algona, Iowa, took the threatened men and sent them to a separate camp in Howard Lake for their own safety. Then the war ended. The full extent of what the Nazis had done became known. The prisoners were repatriated back to a Germany that was nothing but rubble and ash. They went back to powdered eggs and powdered milk and cities that didn't exist anymore. And from that wreckage, letters started arriving. Letters like the one in my drawer. Please be so kind and send me something to eat. Where everyone looks, nothing but rubble, despair, and cold. The time I spent in Owatonna was the best time in my life as a prisoner of war. Might you possibly send me used clothes? It doesn't matter what kind, because I have only the uniform, and my wife and child also have very little. One man, Alfred Mueller, broke his leg jumping into a bomb crater in North Africa, got captured, ended up in a camp in Iowa. After the war, he and his wife came back. moved to Iowa first, then up to Minneapolis, then Faribault, Minnesota. He didn't end up there by accident. He moved there on purpose because of what he saw while he was a prisoner. He donated $1,500 to the camp museum, one of the very first donations. A former prisoner of war funding the preservation of his own captivity. That tells you everything about how he was treated. I keep that letter because it is proof. Over the course of 80-some years, time has eroded this story almost to nothing. That generation has mostly passed. The farmers' wives who fed the enemy at their kitchen tables are gone. The professors who brought art supplies are gone. The little girl who hugged the Italian prisoner's leg while the whole crowd gasped. She'd be pushing 90 now, if she's still here at all. I am 97 years old, and I need you to hear this. When you are given the choice, when the person standing in front of you is supposed to be your enemy, and no one would blame you for turning your back, the road you take matters. The people in these small towns all across Minnesota and Iowa took the harder road. They fed the men who wore the enemy's uniform. They sat them at their tables. They taught them things. And when those men went home to a destroyed country, they carried something with them that had nothing to do with war. They carried a memory of what it felt like to be treated as a human being, and they built their lives on it. This letter in my hand, people still think my grandfather wrote it. He didn't. A man named Nobody Remembers wrote it. From a country that was in ashes, to a family in Minnesota that fed him when they didn't have to. And if we stop telling this story, we lose the proof that ordinary people, given the choice between cruelty and decency, chose decency. That proof is almost gone, but not yet.